Coming up on this episode, as training camp gets underway for the Warriors in Hawaii, the Jonathan Kuminga situation is rearing its head again. I'll tell you why it's a major problem for Steve Kerr and how it could come to define the Golden State season. Welcome back to the Golden State with Mates podcast. Hope you're all having a good start to your week. Day 2 of training camp for the Golden State Warriors is officially in the books, and we're hearing plenty out of Hawaii. Much of it has to do with the starting lineup conundrum for Steve Kerr and, of course, the rest of the rotation ahead of the preseason opener against the Clippers on Saturday, which is just a few days away. What we know so far in regard to the starting lineup: Steph Curry, obviously starting at the point, and Draymond Green is definitely starting as well. However, Steve is still uncertain on whether Draymond will be starting at the 4 or the 5. And this really underpins a major problem for the Warriors, which we'd have to say we knew was coming, because this has been a discussion throughout the entire offseason. The Warriors have 3 front court positions, and they have 4 players in which to really utilise in those positions, although, as we'll get into, there might be some other options that may present themselves across training camp and preseason. But throughout the entire offseason, we've really spoke about, okay, Wiggins, Kuminga, Green, Trace Jackson-Davis, those 4 players really vying for 3 positions. And not only does it depend on those guys individually, but it also depends on how the Warriors wish to play. The major problem here, to put it simply, is that, in my belief, the Warriors, to be any kind of threat in the NBA this season, need Jonathan Kuminga to rise to stardom, to be at least their second best scorer, if not their second best player overall. And from what we're hearing out of training camp right now, I have a genuine doubt on whether Jonathan Kuminga will be a starter for the Golden State Warriors entering this, his 4th season. That's a problem. That's a real concern. And there's so many things going on here, and I'll try to get through all of it. And basically, it's still an educated guess, right? That is my educated guess, that right now, I think Jonathan Kuminga is facing an uphill battle to be a starter for the Warriors this season. Now, again, there's a few things involved in this, so let's go through it. What we do know: Steve has already come out and said that he wants a few things. He wants to return to being an elite defensive team this season, although it was more Mike Dunleavy that put that on the agenda last week, but I'm sure Steve concurs with that. He wants to be a high-volume three-point shooting team. And he's really spoken about Andrew Wiggins as being, a huge feature of the offense, and getting Wiggs 6-7 3-point looks a game. So really, that tells me that if you want to be an elite defense, you have to start a big next to Draymond Green. Draymond himself said today that he is better, essentially, when he's next to a center, that he can play center, but he's better as a power forward. And we saw at the end of last season, the final 11 games of last season, the Warriors were an elite defensive unit with that combination of Draymond Green and Trace Jackson-Davis together. So where does that leave Kuminga when you're also talking about Wiggins? And if Steve wants Wiggs to feature heavily in the offense, to be this 20-point-per-game player that he's outlined him to be, to get up 6-7 threes a game, well, Andrew Wiggins is not going to do that in a bench role. So, again, where does that leave Kuminga in this whole conundrum? And the fact that I believe this guy needs to be starting, but it's the opportunity and where he fits in is becoming smaller and smaller right now. And we had Kendra Andrews of ESPN outline an article yesterday talking about more so the fact there's specific battles going on for specific positions rather than any kind of thought on the Warriors drastically changing who they're going to be. And Kendra was basically saying you've got to fight between Kevon Looney and Trace Jackson-Davis for the starting center spot. You've got Draymond at the 4, and that leaves the small forward spot between Kuminga and Wiggins, right? My biggest issue right now with all of this situation is the fact that we are entering the 4th season for Jonathan Kuminga. We thought he broke through at the end of last season, the second half of the season, where he averaged over 18 points a game, over 54% shooting from the floor. Really developed into being the team's second go-to guy offensively behind Steph. We went through all that, thought all of these issues were behind us, and yet we're entering training camp where Steve and JK and Draymond as well are at odds with who exactly Jonathan Kuminga is as a player. And you would have thought that by year 4 we would have got some clarity on where he sits in the landscape of things in terms of positionally. So you have Steve coming out. He said it obviously at the end of last season that, hey, JK needs to work on his ball handling, on his shooting, all these different things to become a more versatile player to be able to play at the small forward position, right? He's come out last week in an interview, or might have been the week before, either way, recently, in an interview with Tim Kawakami, said that, well, Kuminga can be a 3 if there's a shooting 5 on the floor, of which the Warriors don't have outside of Quinton Post. I've mentioned that already previously on the podcast. And that if Draymond's playing at the 4 and Trace is playing at the 5, that it's going to be very difficult for him to play JK at the 3, right? So right now, it seems like Steve Kerr thinks Jonathan Kuminga is a power forward. Now, in contrast, JK has pretty emphatically, I think he's put a real emphasis on telling everyone this preseason so far that, no, I'm a small forward. He has mentioned that multiple times in multiple different interviews that I'm a small forward in this league, right? He said it again on Tuesday, most recently, that, hey, I'm a small forward. Now, Draymond concurs with him. Draymond is also in disagreement with Steve, it seems, because he came out just today and was asked about the whole JK situation, the positional aspect to it, and said that, no, I think he's a 3. I've always viewed him as that, in my opinion, which is funny. Always viewed him as a 3. If you go on Basketball Reference and check out Jonathan Kuminga's page on Basketball Reference, he's played exactly 5% of his career as a small forward. 5%. And therefore, that's plenty of evidence to suggest that Steve thinks he's a 4. Steve has said publicly that at this point he thinks he's a 4. He said as recently as less than 2 weeks ago that it's going to be difficult for him to play at the 3 over Draymond and Trace. And so right now, his best shot looks like being the small forward position and taking that from Wiggs. But I don't know how that's going to happen if Steve can't alter his perspective and think that JK can be a 3 with Draymond and Trace also on the floor. Because the way this is looking, it looks unlikely. It looks highly unlikely that JK can be in this starting lineup from everything we've heard from Steve on Kuminga individually and on how he wants to play as a team in regards to a high volume of three-point shooting. We know Wiggs is a better shooter than JK. And in terms of being an elite defense, which means unlikely that Draymond's necessarily going to start at the 5 and that Wiggs, as your primary perimeter defender, would also probably have an edge in the defensive area as well over JK. So it's not factual at this stage. There's still an opportunity. There's still potential to see a Wiggins, Kuminga, Draymond front court starting the season. But we also have the defensive aspect to it. Draymond saying he's better next to a center. And Steve categorically saying today that he doesn't want to overwork Draymond at center. That we'll see it a bit, but that he doesn't want to overuse that. That he doesn't want, which I've been saying all offseason, you do not want Draymond Green banging bodies against the big guys in the league, the genuine 7-footers, the Joel Embiid, Nikola Jokic's. Most teams have got, genuine 7-foot bigs nowadays. You don't want Draymond having to go against that on a nightly basis for 20, 25 minutes a game across an 82-game season. It is going to wear him out, and we know Draymond prides himself on being a playoff performer. Well, if the Warriors are good enough to make the playoffs, what kind of level is Draymond going to be at if you're asking him to go through this workload throughout the entire regular season? And so, again, it goes back to the Warriors' deficiencies on the roster in terms of not having a big guy that can shoot. Because if you had a big guy that can shoot, then clearly Steve is happy to alter his perspective and put JK at the 3. He said that. JK can be a 3 if there's a shooting 5. Well, unfortunately, the Warriors don't have that. They have Quinton Post. We'll see what he can develop into, but we're not relying on that right now in the short term. And this is what we're focusing on, is the right now, the present. This is a team that's still built around Steph Curry and still trying to, first of all, make the playoffs and then try and make a deep playoff run. Right? We're not really concerned about quitting post, albeit he's 24. Maybe he can crack the rotation this season, but he's definitely not going to be a starter. And that's what we're trying to work out with JK is, can he be a starter? Because I'm here to tell you right now, if Jonathan Kuminga is not a starter for the Golden State Warriors this season, well, first of all, there won't be a contract extension. If we get to October 21 and Steve's basically telling Mike Dunleavy in the front office, look, I'm probably not going to start JK this season. Well, then the front office is clearly not going to give Jonathan Kuminga the contract that he'll desire, which is, upwards of at least $30 million a season. We've heard obviously reports that he wants the full max at 5 years, $220. You're not going to give that to a guy whose role is even in question in terms of starting lineup. And so there's going to be no extension. And therefore, if JK isn't part of the starting lineup, you have to make a move. You have to make a move. Unless you think that something is drastically going to change during the course of the regular season. And I don't know how that can drastically change unless two things happen. Either one, they go out and trade for a shooting big, or two, JK's shooting and his ability to play at the three next to Draymond and Trace, drastically improves as well, right? Or that, Wiggins falls off a cliff or doesn't return to, what the expectations are. And therefore, Steve's left with no choice but to put JK in there instead of Wiggs. Who knows? It's just becoming a huge positional problem. The fact that Steve is still at odds with JK in terms of what his best position is, and and with Draymond as well, believing that JK is a three. Like, that is a major problem. And again, it's the roster deficiency of the Warriors, not having a shooting big, not having the flexibility, the versatility, and therefore having to basically choose between whether they want offense or whether they want defense. Because if they go defense, and it's clearly a front court of Draymond and TJD, but if they want offense, then it's clearly Wiggs, JK, Draymond. And that, as a result, you're overworking Draymond, and your defense is clearly not going to be at the level you want it to be. And Draymond's not going to be at the level you want him to be individually as a defender. So this is a real problem for the Warriors. And we're hearing so much different stuff about what's going on right now. But I have huge doubts based on what we've heard in media day, with the press conferences that Mike and Steve did last week, and what we're hearing out of the first 2 days of training camp. I have doubts on whether Jonathan Kuminga is going to be a starter for the Warriors, and I think that will frustrate a lot of fans who simply view him as, okay, again, if the Warriors want to be a threat this season, they need him. They need a second star, and Jonathan Kuminga is the best pathway to being a second star. And if he doesn't have that open pathway, that open airfield to go and be that player because he's stuck in a 6th or 7th man role playing just 20 minutes a game, where's the team going? Now, a similar question can be raised in terms of the starting shooting guard position, which is less of a concern to me because Brandon Podziemski's only in his second year. There's still a time frame here in which you can be a little bit more patient with him and his development. But we all kind of got a sense, I suppose, during the off-season that Pods is most likely the guy to replace Clay as the starting two guard next to Steph. But there's still a genuine question mark on that. And both DeAnthony Melton and Buddy Hield are in that conversation in terms of one of those three guys taking the starting shooting guard role. And again, like is the case with, the front court situation, it really comes down to how the Warriors want to play. Do they want the defense? If they want the defense, it's DeAnthony Melton, right? Pods referred to him today as Gary's twin, another version of Gary Payton II. Look pretty similar. Both have the same kind of tenacity and ability on defense. So if it's defense, it's DeAnthony Melton. If it's offense, it's Buddy Hield. If you simply want to replace Klay Thompson and that role of what Klay was doing, it's Buddy Hield, getting up 7-8 threes a game. Shooting over 40% from three, being one of the best shooters in the league, which is exactly what Klay was. So if you want the offense, it's Buddy Hield. I found it really interesting how Anthony Slater of The Athletic was kind of outlining these different options for the Warriors in terms of the starting shooting guard role, and he was mentioning Buddy Hield and referred to how there's some within the organisation that think Buddy Hield's going to average 25 minutes a game. 25 minutes is, I think that's really on the high end for Buddy Hield. I would be surprised. I've mentioned previously during the off-season that I think he's more 15 to 18 minutes, and then if his defense can hold up, obviously some nights he's going to be shooting the ball really well. The game is going to require his shooting. He might play somewhere between 22 and 25 minutes, but if he's averaging 25 minutes, that seems a lot for a guy who has some defensive concerns. You're talking about wanting to be an elite defensive team. Well, if you've got Steph and Buddy Hield as your backcourt both playing over 25 minutes a game, can that lend itself to being a top 5 defense in the league? I don't know. This is a guy that also averaged just 12.8 minutes in the 76ers first round series loss to the Knicks in the playoffs. Again, yes, he had a great game 6 or whatever, or game 5, whatever it was. Game 6 it was, in that final game. But other than that, again, over the entire series, I think he got 2 DNPs and he averaged less than 13 minutes a game. Is he a guy that should be getting 25 minutes for the Warriors? Who knows? I just find that difficult to believe, but obviously Slater's reported that as some within the organisation thinking that he'll average 25 minutes. Again, not just in terms of the defensive concerns with Buddy Hield, but just so much as the myriad of options that Steve has available at the 2 or the 3. Like, I wouldn't be shocked if there's nights where Buddy Hield's out of the rotation completely. And yet on the other end of the spectrum, we're talking about him playing 25 minutes a game. So that's really interesting. And then, of course, the defensive Milton, the offensive Hield. And if you want a combination of both, if you want the best of both worlds, it's Pods. If you want a little bit more versatility, it's Pods in terms of the ball handling, the playmaking, stuff like that. And, of course, the upside of Pods, right? D'Anthony Melton's not going to turn into a star player. He is what he is at this point of his career. He's a high-end role player. He's a very good one. He can be like the 4th or 5th starter on not a championship team necessarily. We haven't seen that, but on a playoff team. We saw that with the Sixers, right? We saw that with the Grizzlies to a degree. So he can be a really high-end role player, but he's not going to be a star. Buddy Hield is a star shooter, but he's not a star. He's not going to be. He's 31 years old at this point. Pods is the guy. Now, he might never be a star, but he clearly views himself as a potential star, has offered his thoughts on wanting to be seen as one of the brightest young stars in the league, as wanting to be in the most improved conversation. The Warriors, in terms of their off-season trade discussions and the reports we heard about Lauri Markkanen, clearly view Brandon Podziemski as a future star. And therefore, again, how do you relate that into the starting shooting guard position in terms of, okay, do we think that maybe Milton or Hield are slightly better options, but for the long term, the upside of Pods is worth giving him that position right now? That's something that Steve's going to have to battle with, right? Now, the other thing that I'm interested in that I would be, there's a couple of aspects that I'd be interested in terms of the starting lineup that will not happen, but I do think should be considered, and that I do think throughout a 6-game preseason, you should have a look at it, right? The primary one is, well, how about we do away with Pods, Milton, and Hield, and you start Wiggins, Kuminga, Green, and Jackson Davis, and say, well, you know what, we're just going all in on defense. We're going all in on size, which is quite different to what the Warriors have done in the past. We're going away from the high volume 3-point shooting, which that's going to be why this doesn't happen. This won't happen for a couple of reasons. The volume of 3-point shooting and Steve still wanting to get plenty of threes up despite Clay's departure. And the second reason is, well, if you have Pods, Milton, and Hield all coming off the bench, how does that work? How does that work in a bench rotation when you have all 3 of those guys coming off the bench? So that's why it won't happen. But in terms of like getting JK in a starting role and still being able to have the Draymond next to a center while also starting Wiggs, that's the only way you could do it. I would like to have a look at that. It doesn't have to be doesn't have to be starting. That unit doesn't have to be starting during any of these preseason games, but I would like to see it on the floor at some point. I think that's interesting. The other thing, which won't happen, we already know it won't happen, but I think should be considered, and I would, and I think at some point we're going to have a stronger discussion about it. I've discussed it before. Draymond coming off the bench. If you really want to limit the toll on him physically, then I think that's a genuine option. I think 6-man role, closing games, no doubt closing games, playing 28 to 30 minutes, still playing his allotted minutes that you would anyway. But in terms of, for the good of this team, for giving JK the runway, as I say, to try and become the second star that the Warriors need, while also having a genuine big out there in TJD, and having Wiggins out there, who you also want to feature heavily in the offense and who is still your primary perimeter defender, I'd be interested in a JK starting at the 4, Draymond coming off the bench, 6-man role. And part of that would also be for Steve, and I've mentioned this before, is, well, he's not going to start 3 really young guys next to Steph. He's not going to say, well, all of a sudden we're handing starting spots to Pods, JK, and TJD. Now, he might still do that. Like, he could do that with, not having Wiggins. But again, I think Wiggins is pretty solidified from what the sounds of it is and how Steve's spoken about him so far. But maybe you can alter that by saying, well, if we do this, we're also not going to start Pods. And therefore, why don't you go with Steph, Melton, Wiggins, Kuminga, TJD? All of a sudden, you'd have Draymond and Pods coming off the bench. Again, those guys can still play close to 30 minutes a game. But so can JK. And you can get him a better pathway. Like, he wants to be a starter. I think the desperation to give him a starting role should be far higher than Pods, for example. And I think it might work out that Pods does get a starting role and JK doesn't. But I think at this point of their respective careers, you need to try and prioritise JK in a starting role, because otherwise, in his 4th season, I'm not sure what you're doing. You're really pigeonholing him and saying, well, this is kind of what you are. We think you're a nice high-end role player, and we don't think you're a star. Because if you think you've got a star in your hands, well, you're giving that player a starting role by his 4th season. You just have to be. Otherwise, what is the point? What is the actual point in bringing him off the bench if you still think this guy's got star potential, right? Especially in the situation the Warriors are at, where they need another star, right? And so it's just such a problematic situation for Golden State right now. The shooting guard spot I'm less concerned with, because, as I said before, I think the need to give Pods a starting role isn't necessarily there like it is with JK. But the JK situation is becoming a huge problem for the Warriors, and it's one that we would have hoped by now, entering his 4th season, wouldn't have been a discussion point. But it's also the inability for the Warriors to go out and get a stretch big, because if you had another shooting fight, if you had Larry Markkinen right now, you could say, all right, we're going to go Steph, Wiggins, Kuminga, Green, Markkinen, right? Now, Wiggs might not be on the team because of salary matching, albeit Markkinen was only on $17 million. So yeah, you could have kept Wiggs. You could have, maybe ultimately had to deal Pods. Sounded like the Jazz didn't want too much interest in Kuminga, given the financial complications around him and being extension eligible. Therefore, that could have been your starting lineup, right? It would have been super big, and you would have retained enough shooting with Markkinen and Steph. And, hopefully Wiggs shoots the ball reasonably well. Draymond shot it at 40% last season. There's enough there for you to be very good on both ends of the floor. Warriors didn't pull that move. They didn't pull a move for any other shooting big at all, aside from drafting Quentin Post. And this is what you're left with. You're left with a genuine question mark, a genuine debate on what Jonathan Kuminga's best position is, and therefore whether he's going to be a starter for the Warriors this season. I don't know. Maybe I'm overestimating the whole starting debate, and maybe if JK's in a 6th or 7th man role and he's still playing 25, 30 minutes a game, maybe it's fine. I just have a hard time thinking that JK is going to go through another season where he's not starting consistently, being happy with that and re-signing him for agency or wanting to. I mean, it's not really up to him because he can get an offer sheet from somewhere else and the Warriors can match it. But again, if the Warriors don't envision a starting role for Jonathan Kuminga, why are you giving him $100+ million? We saw they kind of did that with Jordan Poole. Gave him $120+ million and then thought, oh, actually, no, we don't really want to do this, and got off him before the contract even started. So the Warriors need to make a decision either way. And if the decision is we think Jonathan Kuminga can be a star and that we want to have him around long term, we think he can be the second guy offensively next to Steph, then you must start him. You just have to. And if you don't think that, then you need to actually evaluate trade options. Really, you do. Because he still has some value. And yes, that might be minimized a little bit by the contract situation, but you can still go out and get something pretty significant for Jonathan Kuminga. And it's the same with Moses. And what I've been saying with Moses as well is if Moses Moody is not in the rotation to start the season, then find a deal. Find something, right? Stop hanging on to these guys for so long thinking that, we'll get there eventually. Well, when's eventually? Because we're now going into year 4 for both these guys. But anyway, let me know what you think on the whole starting lineup conundrum, what Steve should do, what you think Steve will do, what you think on the whole Kuminga situation, whether he's a 3, whether he's a 4, what the Warriors should do around that. It's certainly fascinating at the moment. It sounds like Steve, aside from what he's saying to the media, isn't giving away too much in terms of what's going on at training camp, because Kendra Andrews reported that there's been nothing really in terms of starting lineups, playing together or rotations or anything like that. There hasn't been anything really given away in training camp in terms of physically what people are actually seeing and what the media is actually seeing on the floor during scrimmages and stuff like that. That the Warriors are kind of dividing up into 3-4 different groups and all that stuff. But I'll tell you what, there's a preseason game happening in 3-4 days now. There will be something in the next couple of days. By the time you listen to this, there's probably going to be something more in terms of seeing actual lineups, combinations together in training camp that are likely to transition into these preseason games and then further on. So super interested. For those of you watching on YouTube, if you haven't subscribed to the YouTube channel already, that would be greatly appreciated. You can follow me at POK252. That's POK252 on X/Twitter. Again, give me your thoughts in the YouTube section below in the comments. Really appreciated all the responses to my episode after Media Day, and in particular, Draymond's kind of perspective on the Warriors roster and the perspective on players 6 through 10, really being the what delivers the potential of your roster, which again I completely disagree with, but a lot of people in the YouTube comments could see where Draymond was coming from. So again, any thoughts on the Kuminga situation, anything at all in regards to Golden State right now, let me know. And other than that, I'll see you on the next episode.